All right, let's go to 2 Samuel 15. Second Samuel chapter 15. Let's go ahead and read a little bit of this here. Verse number 1, it said, "And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man had a controversy, he came to the king for judgment. Then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. And Absalom said moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand, and he took him, and he kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. And so he arose and he went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women which were concubines to keep the house. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. We'll pause there for the moment. And so as we continue, as I kind of call the fallout from David's sin with Bathsheba, the tragedy for David and his house continues. And so here we understand the last chapter, Absalom had finally been brought back to Jerusalem after having been away for several years, after the, murdering his brother, and we've seen all of that. But now we understand he came back to Jerusalem, and for 2 years had not even seen his father. For 2 years he was there in Jerusalem but did not see David. And we talked about the conflict that was residing within David, because this was his son. David did obviously love his son, but he also knew that justice was called for in the case of his son. And so whereas he wanted to give mercy, he also wanted to provide justice. And so there was a lot going on in the mind and the heart of David. But after 2 years, they see each other. And we talked about at the end of chapter 14, things seem to have resolved. The last verse of chapter 14, it says, and so Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself to his face on the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. And so it seems like, okay, things are well. But we all understand this was all part of the plan for Absalom. He had a plan that here in chapter 15 he finally enacts. And so it is true that Absalom is now the oldest. We talked about this a couple chapters ago. Amnon was the oldest. Amnon was the firstborn after Amnon, did what he did, and Absalom killed him. Now Absalom was the firstborn. And so per the typical means, the way things were normally done, Absalom would have been king. And I mentioned this, I think, last week. We don't know at this point if David knew that Solomon was going to be the king. We know that God chose Solomon. We don't know if at this point David knew that. For all we know, for every practical implication would lead us to believe that David did believe Absalom would be the king one day. But nevertheless, Absalom most certainly thought he was going to be the king. And so one way or another, he figured it was going to be his. But he also knows that the hearts of the people were for David. And if he wanted the kingdom now, he was going to have to change that. And so whereas he might have circumstances, this was obviously not the way to go about receiving the kingdom. And so he devises this plan to turn public opinion in his favor. And so what he did is he would show up every day to the gates. And as we've talked about, and this is consistent throughout the Old Testament, when we think of the gates of the city, we don't typically mean just an entry point. The gates of the city were kind of the town square. This is where business was done. This may not be where everybody was just shopping or whatever, but as far as business transactions and things like that, they would take place in the city gates. And so every day he would show up. And he would show up kind of with what we might refer to as an entourage. And really, it seems as if the only reason he was doing this is to show, hey, I'm important, I have power, I have a foundation behind me. You know, this isn't just one man out there listening to people. No, I've got a whole group of people ready to go at my command, at my bidding. And so he shows up with this show of power. And so people would come to David for judgment. And before they could get to David, Absalom would stop them. And so he would stop them being out there in the gates, and he would listen to them, right? And he would listen to them, and he would ask them where they're from. And they would say, well, here's where I'm from, and here's my problem. And Absalom would say, oh, you absolutely deserve justice. It didn't matter what they said. You absolutely deserve justice. You are clearly in the right. You have been wronged. And he would cry out, oh, if there was a judge in Israel who would listen to you. Oh, if there was just somebody who would take up your case. Because if I were there, if I were the judge, if I were the one making the decisions, I would fight for you, and I would get you everything that you deserve. And he would go through this whole spiel, and he was affectionate with them, right? He would hold their hands, he would touch them, he would kiss them, he would do all these things that was placing him upon their side in their opinion. And so he would do all this, and he would be, he's so dramatic about all this. Now never mind the fact that David most likely would have listened to them. And we can tell this from the previous chapters. As the woman from Tekoa, she comes, she has no problem getting the ear of David. And as far as we know, she didn't purport to be anybody important. She was just this poor widow woman who had a son who had died, and she needed to talk to David. And as for everything we see in the text, she had no problem getting to David. She had no problem speaking with the king. And so probably all of these people who Absalom is talking to would have had the same access to David that she had, but they didn't know that, and Absalom made sure that they didn't know that. And so, at the end of the day, what Absalom was doing, he was playing the politician. He made people think that they had been heard. He made people think that they were right. He made people think that he would fight for them, and by saying so, what he's insinuating is that David won't. Right? David won't fight for you. He showed them affection. And then in verse 5, we see the result of all this. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And this is exactly what he wanted to do. And I want to give this quote by Wiersbe because it's pretty pointed. He said, David had won the hearts of the people through sacrifice and service, but Absalom did it the easy way and the modern way by manufacturing an image of himself that the people couldn't resist. David was a hero. Absalom was only a celebrity. And that's exactly right. He hits the nail on the head with this. Absalom played the celebrity, and as we know, and this has always been true, this is not a modern phenomenon, celebrity wins. If you can get your name in the headlines, if you can get the popular opinion on your side, celebrity wins. And so this is exactly what he did. He turned of the affections of the people. And we're going to see as we go through the coming chapters, even after this whole ordeal with Absalom, we'll see how fickle the people of Israel are. They are ready to throw their support behind anybody they think is going to, get them the money. And so we'll see that as we go. But Absalom is very successful in this. And we don't, obviously, the Bible doesn't give us percentages here. It doesn't tell us 70% of the people are now pro-Absalom and 30%. We get in the news. We've got numbers on everything these days. Popularity opinions and polls and percent and all that. We don't get that. We just know at the end of verse 5, at the end of verse 6, that he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And so when it was time to take the kingdom, then it was a relatively simple process. It was a coup for sure, but he had the numbers. He had the people on his side that he needed to do this. And so when it came time to do this, to actually enact the plan, put things into motion, interestingly enough, he goes to David. and he asks David permission to go to Hebron. Now, I found this curious, and I didn't, in all my studying, I didn't really find why he felt it a necessity to go to David and ask permission. I don't know if it were up to David, if he left. This could possibly insinuate that Absalom was, whether it was real or just he thought this was the case, was on some kind of house arrest. You can't leave Jerusalem, Absalom. We don't know, but he goes to David and he says, hey, I made a vow while I was in Geshur that when I got back I would go to Hebron and I would fulfill this vow and that I would worship God. Well, obviously David, who has no idea that any of this other stuff has been going on, this would be music to his ears. The one thing that David would want for his children more than anything is for his kids to worship the God that he serves. This is true for every parent who's a Christian, and they desire for their children to love God and to follow in their footsteps in worshiping him. And so David is probably thrilled, and he sends him away, ironically, with the phrase, go in peace. And you would think maybe that would strike at the heart of Absalom, but he probably loved it. He was thrilled because his plan is clearly working. And so David says, go in peace, and it all begins. And so Absalom had sent out some spies throughout the land, and he basically sent this message that when you hear the trumpet, right, when you hear this thing, the word's going to come out, and one way or another, and when you hear that, that means Absalom is now reigning in Hebron, and that's the news. That's when this thing is beginning to take place. And so it's interesting. The text tells us that he brings 200 men with him to Hebron. Again, this was a show. It was all a show. He brings 200 men with him to show, hey, listen, this is the kind of contingent that I can draw. This is the kind of strength that I can pull out here, because we're told that these 200 men have no idea what's going on. That's what we're told there. What verse is it? Verse 11. And with Absalom went out 200 men out of Jerusalem, and it says they went out in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. And so whether or not David told them to go, I don't think that's likely. I think Absalom just said, hey, here's what we're doing. We're going to go down to Hebron. We're going to fulfill this vow. We're going to go worship. And so they go, having no idea that they're being drawn into this plan of this coup against David. But again, all of it was for the optics. Well, here comes Absalom, and now he's reigning in Hebron. And look, he's bringing 200 people with him from Jerusalem. Right? Clearly people are on his side. And so he's starting to draw people one way or another, whether or not they know it. And he goes, and he's starting to get some momentum. And then worst of all was the defection of David's counselor Ahithophel. And so we see this in verse 12. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, and Ahithophel goes. It says the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And so this was a big deal. We'll see this more so in the next chapter. But Ahithophel was seen kind of as a flawless seer. The counsel of Ahithophel, we'll read in the next chapter. People considered Ahithophel, when he gave counsel, that was God himself speaking. If he gave counsel, that is perfectly right and true. And so the fact that he had Ahithophel now on his side was not only a sincere blow to David, because he was a very trusted and loved advisor, but this gave legitimacy to Absalom's coup. And so Absalom now had numbers. Again, whether or not the people even knew what they were doing, they were there with him. And so from an optics perspective, he had numbers. He had legitimacy because he had Ahithophel now. And so now he has the momentum, right? And anytime we see through history, and these things don't happen all that often, but these things do happen. And anytime we look down through history and we see successful coups, right, they have to have certain things. You can't just have one man. You have to have the numbers. You have to have legitimacy if you're going to bring anybody else. Nobody's going to jump on a ship that they think is going to sink the next day, right? And so you have to have numbers, you have to have legitimacy, and then you have to have momentum. And those are the three things, really, that when you look at, you see this has the possibility of success. Obviously, it's never guaranteed, but it has the possibility of success. And Absalom had everything he needed in order to turn the tides and to rip the kingdom away from the hands of David. And ultimately, we see that, at least for a time, that is exactly what happens. And so, well, we read this earlier, so I won't read it again, but David is told, obviously, word probably gets to him pretty fast here, and once he realizes the danger of what's taking place, he decides to flee. Now, at first, you might think, well, that seems cowardly. But David is not fleeing out of fear. He flees for a very specific reason. He leaves and he takes those closest to him, and it saves them. But what it does is it saves Jerusalem. Because, remember, Absalom is no longer in Jerusalem. He's in Hebron. And if Absalom wants to easily take the kingdom away from David, the way to do that is to take Jerusalem away from David. And so David knows if he's going to do this, they're going to have to attack Jerusalem. And so he leaves Jerusalem to save Jerusalem. He leaves Jerusalem so that there can be no siege, so that there can be no attack. And so not only does that save the city itself, but more importantly, it saves the people in that city. And so this wasn't a cowardly act. This was a courageous act of sacrifice for David to take a few people with him to leave and to save the city, leaving it behind. But we do at least get the sense that David expected this to be a temporary thing, because he leaves behind concubines. He leaves behind a few concubines to keep the house, as it says in verse 16. Now that's going to play an important role, the fact that he leaves these women behind. It's going to play an important role in the next chapter against David, actually. But nevertheless, it does seem that he kind of figured this was going to be a temporary thing. Now, we get the rest of the chapter essentially kind of shows us a few snippets of some of the people who left with David, or at the very least tried to leave with David. And so the first one is this man by the name of Ittai. And so let's start reading there in verse 19. It says, Then said the king to Ittai the Gittite, Wherefore goest thou also with us? Return to thy place, and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger, and also an exile. Whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us? Seeing I go whither I may, return now and take back thy brethren, mercy and truth be with thee. And then it says, And Ittai answered the king, and he said, As the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, death or life, even there also thy servant be. And David said to Ittai, Go and pass, and little ones that were with him. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And so the first man we come to is this man named Ittai. And so David tells him, listen, number one, you're not even an Israelite. You're a foreigner. Now, it seems like Ittai had possibly proselytized and had come over because he wanted to be with David, right? That certainly is the sense that we get. But David tells him, you're a foreigner, you're not even an Israelite, you've just come the day before. It's a very unfortunate time for Ittai to show up. You just got here the day before, and so essentially, don't come with me. Why is he saying that? Not because he doesn't want his support, but he's saying it's going to be dangerous. David knows wherever he goes, wherever these people that are with him go, there's going to be trouble that follows. One way or another, this was not going to be a simple turnover. Right? Whether the kingdom winds up back in his hands or whether it goes into the hands of Absalom, this is not going to be an easy thing. David knows one way or another there's going to be bloodshed here. And so, don't come with me because the sword's going to follow. And so, you need to go where it's safe. You just got here. And let's be honest, not only does I do believe him in that he's fearful for this man's safety, but also he did just show up the day before. David doesn't really know this man. Right? And so there could be a sense where, for your own safety and for trust reasons, why don't you go ahead and go back? However, Ittai shows his clear devotion to David. And he says, As the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there will my servant be. Now, he could have been lying through his teeth. And David knows that. David's not an ignorant man. David understands that this man could be lying. He could be a plant. He could have been sent here by Absalom. But apparently, in the way in which Ittai reveals this or expresses this to David, David believes him. Because not only does he allow Ittai to go with him, but we're going to see in a couple of chapters, he actually makes him essentially a captain over his small group of men as they fight with Absalom. And so this man gained the trust very quickly of David, and he did so based upon his sincere devotion to David. And we see a very similar devotion by Paul to Christ. The wording actually is very similar. He says in Philippians 1, he says, with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. And so Isaiah says, where you go, I go. If that's life or that's death, I'm fine with that. Paul says the same thing. Where Christ sends me, I will go. Whether that's life or that's death, that's fine with it. That's fine with me. It's kind of very similar to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth says, no, I go where you go. And so this is a very, very strong devotion. And I didn't put this in here, but I think it speaks to the kind of man that David was. Obviously, we know that David is in a period of his life of judgment because of a tremendous sin that he committed. But also we understand that David was a godly man, generally speaking. For the biggest part of his life, for most of his walk, David was a very godly man. And the fact that this foreigner, only getting there the day before, is so devoted to living and dying for David shows the kind of reputation that David held. And that in itself is a great example for us as Christians, because obviously our reputation does matter. Our reputation matters a lot. And so David clearly had one that people were not only willing to or desiring to be around, but willing to go and die for. That's the kind of man that David was. And so David allows him to go. And all of those who are with him, they cross over the brook Kidron toward the way of the wilderness. And as I mentioned, David is so impressed with Ittai that he's going to later allow him to have a leadership position in his in the battle against Absalom. Now, also part of David's loyal men are the Levites. The Levites led by the priests Zadok and Abiathar, who try to bring out the ark to follow David. And so let's read in verse 24. And lo, Zadok also and all the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. And so they're crossing over the brook. And the king said unto Zadok, carry back the ark of God into the city. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again, and show me both it and his habitation. But if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here, let him do to me as seemeth good unto him. And the king said also unto Zadok the priest, art not thou our seer? Return unto the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz thy son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. He says, see, I will tarry in the plain of the wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. And Zadok therefore and Abiathar carried the ark of God again into Jerusalem, and they tarried there. And so he also has the support of the Levites. And so it's important also, I just want to point out again, something that we've seen so many times already, 1st and 2nd Samuel, are the contrasts that the author consistently points out. Right? Contrast Absalom, who has, you could say, a strong contingent of followers, but followers who don't even know they're following him. Followers who have no idea what's going on. Followers are just told, hey, go to Hebron with Absalom. Okay, we'll go to Hebron with him. But they have no idea that there's a coup taking place. They're not going because they're devoted to Absalom. They just go because they're clueless. They don't have any idea what's going on. And then contrast that with David, who have not only just these random foreigners, but also the priests who full well know the situation. I mean, here they are fleeing, crossing the brook Kidron. They're fleeing, but their devotion to David is such that they're willing to endure. They're willing to go. And so there's obviously a contrast being made here by the author of Samuel, showing us the kinds of men that David and Absalom were. But again, David has the support of the Levites, as seen in the priests Zadok and Abiathar. They try to bring over the ark, but David won't allow it. Now, I think, just in my opinion, I do believe that David is basing this opinion based on the previous history of Israel. Now, I know it's been a little bit, but way back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Israelites are fighting the Philistines. It's not going well for them. And so they say, well, let's bring out the ark, right? We'll go get the ark. We'll bring the ark to the battlefield, and that'll basically force God to let us win, right? That's kind of what they thought. And we know that it didn't turn out well for them. The Philistines not only beat them handedly, and then steal the ark. And so we understand that didn't work. And so the Israelites viewed the ark as some kind of religious talisman that would bring them good luck. And David understands now. He says, no, I'm not dependent upon that. It doesn't matter where the ark is. It matters what God wants. That's what matters. And so David places not only his faith in God, but he places his fate in God's hands. Right? He says, if I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, then he will bring me again. And he says, and show me both it, the ark, and his habitation. Right? So if this is God's will, this isn't the last time I'm seeing the ark. Right? God will bring me back. He says, but if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here am I. Let him do to me as seemeth good unto me. And so in other words, the ark is not going to change the circumstances. God's will is going to happen. Again, I do believe that David believed he was going to be back. And so he said, if God wills it, I don't need the ark. God's going to put me back. If God doesn't will it, then that ark's not going to change anything. Right? So take it back. Let it go back in Jerusalem where it belongs. Now, this does not mean, however, that David had to sit around and wait for God to act. This doesn't mean David is placing his faith fully into God's hands, but it doesn't mean I'm just going to sit back and do nothing, and then God will make plain and just kind of move me where he wants me. So what happens is he sends both Zadok and Abiathar with their sons back to Jerusalem where they could essentially kind of spy out the situation. They could listen. They could send back information to David. And so strong faith and idleness are not the same. Now, there is a difference in waiting on God to reveal his plan and then acting and then trying to jump headfirst into something and convincing yourself it's God's will. But that's not the same thing as just sitting back and saying, I'm not going to do anything. God's going to do everything. And David wasn't willing to do that. And so this is, again, he's acting very wisely. He's acting in faith. And that's exactly what we would expect from a man after God's own heart. And so David is doing things here the right way. Obviously, not always, but he's not a sinless man. And so let's start reading in verse 30. It says, and David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet, and he wept as he went up. And he had his head covered, and he went barefoot. And all the people that was with him covered every man his head. And they went up, weeping as they went up. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators, and with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount where he worshipped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came and met him with his coat rent and earth upon his head, unto whom David said, If thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden unto me. But if thou return to the city, and say unto Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now also be thy servant. Then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And hast thou not there with thee Zadok and Abiathar the priest? Therefore it shall be that when the thing soever thou shalt hear out of the king's house, thou shalt tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Behold, they there have with them their two sons, Ahimaaz and Zadok's son, and Jonathan Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send unto me everything that you can hear. And so Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. And so it is at this point that as David is ascending the Mount of Olives, and we'll come back to that thought here in a minute, but as David is ascending the Mount of Olives with signs of mourning, he and all those who are with him, he learns of Ahithophel. Now, this was a blow, as I mentioned earlier. This was a blow to David. In fact, many believe that this was what David had in mind when he wrote Psalm 41:9, which says, Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. And so this was a betrayal. To be sure. David felt that. And not only was it a betrayal because David was close with this man, but it was a betrayal because he understands how wise Ahithophel was. And he understands that his situation just got a whole lot more difficult if Absalom actually has Ahithophel counseling for him. And so he's deeply hurt. But again, he placed the problem at the feet of God and simply prayed out, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And so he didn't seek any hurt upon him. He wasn't praying for revenge. He wasn't praying that God would just strike Ahithophel dead. He just said, God, let him give bad advice. If he's going to give advice, let it be bad advice. Now, almost immediately, an answer comes to David's prayer in the form of his friend Hushai. Now, Hushai comes to David in mourning for his friend. They're close. But David tells him it's going to be too much of a burden for him to stay. What he means by that is, I'm not going to risk your life. Right? You're too close to me, and I have something that you could do that's not going to place you in the same danger if you stayed. And so he was to get into Absalom's inner circle in order to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And so David's prayer was, God, let Ahithophel's advice be bad, and then God essentially answers that prayer, but not how David maybe originally intended. And so the answer to that prayer came in the form of his friend, who would kind of turn Absalom's focus against the advice of Ahithophel. And we'll see this actually take place, and we'll see how this comes to pass. Not in this chapter, but this does happen. And so Hushai would be there, and he would try to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel and then send back any information through the channels David has already put in place. And so again, David is he's very wise. We get that all the way through 1st and 2nd Samuel. He's wise in the way that he acts. He's not just some ignorant man sitting back and again saying, well, I don't know what to do, and I'll just have to let God take care of everything. No, his faith was completely in God to act as God wanted to act. But again, that didn't mean that David was going to sit back and do nothing. And so David is setting up ways in which he could get information. And I wanted to end with this because I think there's obvious correlations here. But we see in verses 30 and 31 that David and 32, I guess, David is going up to the Mount of Olives. And so as he's going up to the Mount of Olives, he's both weeping and worshiping. And so he's weeping. They're going up with the signs of mourning. But then you see in verse 33, it says, then when they come to the top of the mount where he worshiped God. And so David is on top of the Mount of Olives praying, weeping, and worshiping. And so obviously when we read that, we think of David's greatest son. We think of Jesus making his way to that very same place, the Mount of Olives. The garden there, it's not a tremendously large area. And so as David is up there, obviously we don't know if it's in the exact same spot, but it's in the same location that Jesus was the result of his own sin. As we've talked about, all of this is the fallout of the sin of David and Bathsheba. All of this is because God said the sword is not going to leave your house. All of this is the result of that particular sin. And so David is weeping because of his own sin. And of course, we understand Jesus' weeping was the result of ours. Right? Jesus weeps for sin, not his own. David weeps for sin, but it was his own. And so obviously we see the correlation here between what David would do and what Jesus would come and do and perfect it. David, he says, the rightful king has been rejected and plods up the Mount of Olives weeping. The scene will be repeated. The descendant of David, the rightful king, according to chapter 7, will be seen on the Mount of Olives, and he will be weeping, not so much over his rejection as over the doom of those who have rejected him. And so again, basically everything we see David do is in not all things, obviously not his sin with Bathsheba, but most of the things we see David do give us a picture of what his greatest son would come and do. Obviously, they have very different foundations behind them. They have very different results behind them. But this is another very clear example of something that the son of David would do in light of what David did, but better, perfect, and with a perfect result, and a more holy reason. But we see the consequences of sin. And one thing that is very, very important to keep in mind, really from chapters about 13 through 18, all of the things we're going to see with the fallout with Absalom and all that, is to go back to chapter 12 and to see that God gave grace to David in that he didn't take his life. God gave grace to David. He didn't take his life. But as we've been talking about, that doesn't mean that sin doesn't carry natural consequences. There are natural consequences, and these were some of the natural consequences that were the fallout of that particular sin. Our eternal debt has been paid. We don't have to worry about the eternality of our sin. But that does not mean that there are not going to be periods in our life where we are not reaping the consequences of sinful actions and decisions that we have made in this life. But at the end of the day, all glory goes to God. All glory goes to God because whether or not we reap those consequences here, the debt has been paid, and we're not the one who paid it. And so we still owe all of our, in fact, we'll talk a little bit more about that this morning, but all the glory and worship and praise belongs to the one who paid the debt for us that we couldn't pay. And so David is learning that, and he's learning that in a very big, dramatic fashion. Obviously, the consequences of our sin will likely, not impossible, but likely never rise to the level that David is facing. Probably most of us are never going to have children who do what his children did. Obviously, we don't have kingdoms to be ripped away from us. We can't reap the same kind, but that doesn't mean consequences still don't follow. And so in that, there are still lessons to be learned and truths to be seen. We see just how much time the author Samuel spends, because we're not done. We still got several chapters just following this particular story. And so this is obviously something that God wanted us to pay attention to, and I think for good reason. But let me pray this morning, and we'll be dismissed.